Hi, Ted Morrissey here. Just a quick video about getting started. In the announcements, I talk about the fact that I think there are basically two kinds of creative writers, creative anything. And those are people who plan ahead of time, kind of outline what they want to do before they get started writing or painting or whatever it might be. And those who just kind of jump right in and start drafting and kind of figure it out as they go. I mentioned that I'm very much the latter sort of writer where I just sort of jump in and have to kind of figure it out as I go. Um, in this video, though, I want to talk about a somewhat different aspect and actually kind of the physical aspect of creating text. And before I do that, though, I want to plug this guy. I mentioned William H. Gass, and he is my literary idol. This is a book, Conversations with William H. Gass, that I have been using and abusing for many years. It's just a compilation of interviews that Gass has done. It's not all of them. There are lots of other interviews, some you can find online, some in other journals that were not collected in this particular book. But I have really used it a lot, both for my academic work on Gass, but also as inspiration to me as a writer. And I highly recommend getting hold of a copy somewhere eventually, and seeing what Gass has to say about the writing process, about publishing, about reading, about teaching, all kinds of things. Conversations with William H. Gass. Another book I want to promote is Gass's book, Fiction and the Figures of Life, which he published in 1970. So it's been around quite a while, actually. But it is largely a craft essay book where he talks about his theories in terms of plot development, characterization, tone, mood, all those kinds of things. Very influential. A lot of writers have read it over the years and have drawn from it. I find great inspiration in it. So this is another book that I would encourage you to take a look at. In just a few weeks, I'm going to be presenting a paper in Singapore on Gass's narrative theories, and I'll be drawing from Fiction and the Figures of Life quite a bit, as well as from the interviews and other Gass stuff. Right? But the thing I wanted to talk about was physically creating text. I think in this day and age, we are accustomed to thinking about writing on computers. I've got my laptop out here. I'm recording this video on. So a lot of people write on their laptops. You can go to a Starbucks or a number of kind of places like that, and you'll see people pecking away, presumably on their novel or whatever it might be. And I think that there's a definite difference in terms of what you produce based on how you're producing it. And for my non-academic stuff, my papers on Gass, journalistic stuff, I write reviews, I do all kinds of things like that. I'm perfectly comfortable composing on the keyboard. But when it comes to my creative work, specifically my short stories, my novels, and my poetry, I have to write by hand. For years now, I've been using these little memo pads. This one's actually about done. I've got a whole cabinet full of used memo pads that I've accumulated over the years. And what I do is I write by hand in these little memo pads. And then eventually, when I have enough material kind of brought together, then I'll sit down at the computer and start to kind of type it up into maybe a little more, lucid kind of draft and kind of work with it from there. But I really do think that writing by hand really helps me to connect to parts in my brain that lead to more interesting, creative kind of stuff than if I'm just typing on the computer. And I know I'm not alone in that. There are a lot of writers and so on who really believe that tactile approach of holding a pen or a pencil and that the connection between the hand and the brain really unlocks things that maybe just pecking away on a keyboard doesn't necessarily. Now, a little memo pad is just one thing. Obviously, there are lots of other ways one might write. In a video that you've been offered, that writer writes on index cards. I know the author Nabokov, who you can see, back over here. Nabokov. I'm a big Nabokov fan. And he always wrote on index cards when he was writing a novel, maybe his short stories too. I'm not really sure about that, but definitely his novels. And then after he wrote basically the whole novel on index cards, he would kind of rearrange them and retype them into, full page manuscripts. Or actually, I think his wife did a lot of that retyping for him, and then he would work with it further from there. Years ago, I taught a creative writing class. It was just in the summer. It was just, very brief. It was only for a couple of weeks, but we kind of met several hours a day. But it happened to meet in a particularly large classroom. And so on one of the first class sessions, I think maybe the second class session, I tried this experiment, and I brought into the classroom and set up these various stations, and they're various kind of writing stations. And at one station, I had tracked down actual quills, like raven feathers, I think is what I ended up finding. Quills, and I had an ink bottle there, and then I had some kind of heavy fiber paper. And basically, I was trying to recreate how Shakespeare would have written, the actual physical process with a quill and ink and writing on this heavy paper. And then I set up another station that was my Virginia Woolf station, and I had a fountain pen and some paper that people would write on. I set up a manual typewriter with paper in the carriage, and that was kind of my Hemingway station, although actually Hemingway wrote his first drafts with pencil and paper, then typed them on the typewriter. But anyway, a manual typewriter I set up, and then I had a computer set up as well, and maybe one or two other. It's been a while, I can't remember. And basically, I had my students go from station to station to station. I gave them, 5 minutes or whatever it was per station, and asked them to try to just write. Obviously they weren't under the gun to try to write some brilliant prose, but just physically try to put some words on the page and try it via these different processes, whether it's quill and ink, whether it's a manual typewriter, whether it's a fountain pen or whatever it might be. And then after they all worked their way through the station, we just kind of talked about it, and everyone agreed that it definitely impacted what they were thinking about and how they were thinking about it to be producing text in these different ways. Now, obviously, it was a very short experiment. I've always thought, I'd like to try to write a whole short story the way Shakespeare did, and I realize now all these years later I've never gotten around to doing it. Maybe I need to work on that this summer. But I definitely think that how we write, the physical process of how we put words on the page or eventually the screen or whatever, definitely impacts what we write and the quality of what we write and so forth. Now, don't get me wrong. I know there are lots of writers who write on the keyboard and they write great stuff. Gass wrote at the typewriter and then eventually at the computer. So he definitely, was able to connect with those parts of his brain that he needed to connect with via typing, on a keyboard. But I know a lot of writers who really prefer to write. So I would just encourage you to think about your process. How do you put words on the page or on the screen? And try maybe a different approach. If you are a writer by hand, maybe try composing on the keyboard. Or if you're a keyboard composer, try writing on paper and trying a scene or two written by hand. It doesn't matter if your handwriting is terrible. Mine is pretty bad, because really you're the only one that's going to read it. So it's just a matter of connecting with the brain. All right, so I'm going to stop there. I just wanted to talk about that process of writing, whether you're doing it by hand or by fingers on the keyboard. Some people dictate. Henry James eventually got what we now know would have been carpal tunnel, and he was in so much pain he wasn't able to write by hand any longer, so he hired a secretary, and he dictated his last several short stories and novels to a secretary, and then his secretary would type up the manuscript and then give it to him to correct and so forth. We know John Milton, the great poet of Paradise Lost fame, etc. He went blind later in life, and so he dictated Paradise Lost to one of his daughters, and she wrote it down, and so forth. So maybe dictation is another approach that maybe you could try using if you haven't tried that approach before. All right, I'm going to stop there, so I don't want this video to be too long, but I'd be interested to hear eventually what you might think about this subject.